Annelise Heinz is the author of the recently released book, Mahjong, A Chinese Game and the Making of Modern American Culture. A historian at the University of Oregon, her work has been featured on national public radio and international Chinese television. Annelise has lived and played Mahjong in the United States and southwestern China. Joining Annelise today is Sarah Breger, deputy editor of Moment magazine and director of the Daniel Pearl Investigative Initiative. Sarah has won numerous awards, including first place for Religion Reporting of the Year from the Religion News Association and first place for Best In-Depth News Writing on Religion from the American Academy of Religion. Please welcome Annelise Heinz and Sarah Breger.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thanks for putting this together. It's a nice, respite from today's news, even just for an hour. It's nice to be focused on this. Annelise, for the uninitiated, what is Mahjong and what are some of the basic rules of the game?
Great. Well, thank you so much for having here. Thank you to all the attendees for being here. And I imagine we have quite a number of avid Mahjong players in the audience. So for those of you who are familiar with the game, keep in mind this is just going to be a super brief introduction. And for those of you who are interested in learning more, there are tons of resources to learn how to actually play the game. That's not what we'll be talking about right now. But big picture, very basic. Mahjong is a game played with tiles instead of cards. And I'm going to share my screen to show an image of what those, especially the older sets made out of bone and bamboo. These are the traditional tiles. I'm holding here a set that was made in the 1960s. And you play with the traditional game, somewhat similar to the card game Gin Rummy, in that you're making sets of winning hands that correspond to different combinations of tiles, because the tiles make suits, and I'll show that picture here. And there are some unsuited tiles as well, but the tiles make suits. And so, for example, part of a winning hand might be a set of consecutive numbers in a single suit, for example. That's a traditional Chinese game. Many of the people on our call today, I imagine, are probably playing what's now called American Mahjong, and that's run by the National Mahjong League. There are actually multiple variants of the game that especially or uniquely emerged in the United States in the 20th century, but the most popular and widespread by far is the League's game, and so that's what's known today as, quote, American Mahjong. And the picture that I'll show you now is of a table of American or national Mahjong players. And one of the distinguishing features that you can see is that they're playing with their tiles lined up on racks. That's something that Americans do. Most other Mahjong players around the world don't do that. And they play with a card in front of them. And that is the League's annual rule card. And here I have one from 1963 and 64. And it changes every year so that the winning hands, rather than having a wide range of possibilities, hundreds of different combinations in the traditional game, there's a set of about 60 winning hands, and the League designs and changes those every year. And so the strategy for each game is different depending on which game you're playing.
It's funny, before I read your book, I didn't realize that there were different types of Mahjong. I kind of thought the American Mahjong was what everyone played.
Most people don't know that whatever version they're playing is not the only version. So that's very common. When I talk to people about the card, for example, if someone's playing Chinese Mahjong, they're shocked to learn that people play with something like a rule card and that there's an organization that changes it every year. And on the other hand, when I talk to people who have only ever experienced American Mahjong with a card, they're shocked to learn that they're the only ones who play with a card. So that's often the case.
So that actually gets to my next question about origins. In your book, you wrote about how when you were interviewing people, some people actually thought, well, people thought that it was an Eastern European game, and some people thought the word Mahjong was Yiddish. But what are the actual origins of the game?
Yeah, so the actual origins are in China in the mid to late 1800s, in the area around Shanghai. And the game became popular in certain urban centers in China in the late 19th century, but it was just one of many games. The real transition that makes Mahjong the game that we know today, the roots of that are in the early 1920s when it becomes an enormous international fad.
So yeah, how did it get to America in the early 1920s to become this, I think what you call a craze?
Yes, it definitely was a craze, and people used that word a lot at the time too. It really is almost impossible to overemphasize how popular it was at the time, and it became a part of widespread American culture because it was marketed as a new and exotic and cosmopolitan game, and it was brought to the U.S. by initially, especially American marketers, and most importantly, a man named Joseph Park Babcock, who was a Standard Oil representative stationed in China. And he learned enough Chinese to communicate with locals, which was quite unusual. Actually, most foreigners did not have to learn Chinese, and they didn't bother to. This was in a semi-colonial context. And he did, and he learned Mahjong. Again, he was in these urban centers where it was becoming popular. And he first started introducing it to American expatriates who were living in Shanghai in the 1910s. And it became really popular among these social clubs. And he thought, let's see if we can make this popular in the States. They first did like a little experimental trial run in 1920 on Catalina Island, where Hollywood, this early years of Hollywood where celebrities vacationed, and his wife helped popularize it among these actresses. And they thought, okay, we've got something here. He started a business, the Mahjong Company of China, and launched in 1922 a campaign that succeeded beyond his wildest dreams and soon inspired a ton of competition as well. So he was not the only person in the scene for very long.
I liked one thing in the book, you were talking about how there were all these articles kind of pitting Mahjong against bridge, and Mahjong came in as this usurper game that people were worried about.
Absolutely. So at the time, some of our listeners may already know, bridge was really popular, and it was seen as the pastime of society. It was a kind of high status game. It was seen as a game for educated people. And it is a very, very challenging game. And it was also seen as a European and especially a British game because it became popular in the United States via a British influence. And so Mahjong was marketed as a Chinese game, and it was marketed as an alternative to bridge for, quote, society, for the elite. In fact, it becomes a game really for everyone. But it's important to note that in that conversation, race was really clearly also a factor here. And the game was often, because it was marketed so strenuously as this, quote, exotic Chinese game, against then this British stalwart game of bridge, it was also talked about in language that echoed immigration debates and a kind of xenophobic response to this Chinese invasion. And a lot of times that was tongue-in-cheek, and that's not to say that it wasn't also underwritten, right, by a kind of racist humor that was really widespread, mainstream types of conversations at the time.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising that Mahjong was so popular when at the same time, there was this, anti-foreign, particularly anti-Chinese sentiment kind of bubbling in the surface. How did people square away those two things?
Yeah, so this is a real irony that the game reaches this peak fad, not only happenstance as a Chinese game in this era of anti-Asian sentiment, but in fact, emphatically as a Chinese game, because it was a Chinese game as part of its popularity. And that happens for a couple of different reasons. One important one is the way that the game was marketed. And so and again, Babcock is really one among many at this point in the midst of the fad. And particularly one of his primary competitors really launched a campaign saying Mahjong is actually used to be a game of the ancient elite Chinese court, the mandarins, and it has been corrupted by modern day degradations of Chinese society. And I am selling this resurrected ancient royal version of the game. And all of that conversation, there was over and over again an emphasis on this game really being likened to the ancient royal court, and explicitly as something that was apart from contemporary Chinese Americans and Chinese people. And that is not at all true, right? We know this is a modern game, but that was an appealing version of the story to people who were still invested in distancing themselves from Chinese people and in fact rejecting Chinese people. So that was a key part of it.
And at this point, it was not a particularly Jewish game. It was a game for everyone, especially white women.
Right. Yes. So Jewish Americans were absolutely playing this game, and they were playing it in ways that directly paralleled other Americans, especially white Americans. And so one of the things that you see in 1920s Mahjong culture as it takes off as this huge fad is white women dressing up in Chinese costume to play the game. And they did that in really literally, stage performances, whether that's a ballet or a garden play, but also to host each other in each other's homes. Saks Herald Square had this advertisement in 1924 advertising Chinese-inspired dresses that you could wear to your friend's house to play Mahjong. So it's really, you see this show up over and over again. And I talk in the book, as you know, about why I think that is. And a lot of that has to do with the intersections between race and gender, and also an opportunity for white women, especially respectable matrons, not just flappers, not just the young, to actually push on some of these boundaries of what was newly respectable kinds of femininity. And because Asian women were especially seen as sexualized, inhabiting that costume and that persona was a way people talked about it as, quote, titillating, right? To use these words in the game, to put on these dresses, and it allowed them to experiment with and inhabit these changing boundaries of respectable gender and sexuality. And it did so on the basis of racial stereotypes. Things are totally intertwined.
But the initial craze was pretty short-lived, and it kind of, by the mid-1920s, Mahjong was not as popular anymore. But then in 1937, Dorothy Meyerson came along, and the National Mahjong League. Can you tell me a little bit about how she and the league changed the trajectory of Mahjong in America?
Absolutely. So yeah, the fad does die out, but people continue playing the game in pockets, in various pockets. Certainly Chinese Americans continue playing the game, Japanese Americans, as well as a number of kind of WASP communities and Jewish communities. And one of those pockets that continued playing were a number of Jewish women in the New York area. Most importantly to this story, Dorothy Meyerson. She launched a business of her own, trying to market what she called her streamlined version of the game. And she was contacted, so she was getting traction with this. She was contacted by another person, Viola Cecil, who was also really interested and invested in bringing this game, what they believed was a great game, back into popularity. So she contacted Dorothy Meyerson and said, let's start this league. And so in 1937, they had their first meeting. Hundreds of women showed up from around the New York area, way more than they expected. And people were passionate about how do we come together to create a new standardized version of the game? Because part of what happened in the 1920s, in the craze years, is that it was so popular and so widespread, and there were so many competing marketers, again, saying, no, I'm selling you the right version, I'm sending you the authentic version, that it fractured. And it was hard there would be huge debates if people sat down and were saying, no, I'm playing the right way, you have to play my way. And so the league set out to standardize a game with streamlined rules. And over the next decades, in part in conversation with this passionate group of players that continue to grow, they created a new version of the game that eventually actually involved new tiles. Like I said, the rule card is a substantially different version. But it spreads along Jewish women's networks. And so the league is really how it becomes a part of Jewish American culture.
So even though, I mean, it makes sense that because, Jewish women were the people who started it, it would be connected to Jewish American women. But I'm wondering if there's anything else, like why did it become the thing that people associated with Jewish American women during that time?
Yeah, well, that story is really rooted in the 1950s and 60s. And the reasons for that have to do with gender and ethnicity in a particular historical moment of mid-century America. And so although the league their vision is that this is going to be, everybody's game again, right? This is helping return to this kind of mainstream craze years. But what happens is that it primarily spreads along Jewish women's networks. That's who's running the league. That's who's developing the game. But it is growing during the late 1930s through World War II. It is growing, but it's not what it becomes in the 1950s and 60s, as you say, of like, this is an iconic part of especially middle class, mid-century Jewish American culture. And that is due to a number of factors that make it both possible and desirable to have this special night of Mahjong night, where women would host each other, rotate among each other's homes, and have that time and space carved out for themselves, and also have something that marked their communities in a very subtle way as Jewish in the midst of what was happening during the 1950s and post-war years, which was en masse a kind of generational shift. I'm not saying that everyone was able to equally access upward mobility among Jewish Americans, but many, many more were able to enter the middle class in a new way because of structural changes to both discrimination and economic changes, especially with the GI Bill after World War II, and how Jewish Americans were newly able to access this suburbanizing landscape, in part because they were protected from some discrimination that they would have encountered earlier in a way that African Americans and Asian Americans still were not. And so Italians and Jews become what are called white ethnics in this period. It's a process of an upwardly mobile new kinds of access that is strongly associated with whiteness in American culture. And that poses both possibilities, right, opportunities, and risks of cultural loss and erasure. And so there are many ways that there becomes a kind of Jewish distinctiveness still in this context. And Mahjong is one of those ways. Nobody was talking about that explicitly, right? But it becomes, as many people I interviewed said, quote, our game. This is our game. This is special. And also women who were often highly educated, often had been working in the workforce, were disproportionately, as partly with this upward mobility, they were leaving the workforce to raise young children. And they were in these new communities, and they were often experiencing the constraints of 1950s domestic life. And they were connecting to other young mothers during the Mahjong games. But the way that that first happened is also connected to the leisure and vacationing landscapes that Jewish Americans are also forging at this time, especially the Catskills, but not only the Catskills, also beach clubs, other summer vacationing communities all over, especially the East Coast and Midwest, but all over the country. And those patterns that get established in those summer vacationing communities of women connecting to each other, of relaxing together, Mahjong becomes this way to transfer some of those rhythms of leisure into the home in one night a week. And that is really unusual for the time. This was very unusual and something that became extremely important to a lot of women's lives.
Could you describe kind of the kind of Catskills Mahjong scene a bit? It seems to have
Yes.
kind of a very specific rhythm that I find fascinating.
Yes, absolutely. So and I imagine there are lots of people also on this call who had their own memories of specifically the Catskills, but also a lot of other vacationing communities, I bet. So during the summers in New York, of course, it was atrociously hot, and just most places didn't have air conditioning. And the Catskills becomes a place with earlier roots, but that really flourishes in the 1950s and 60s as a summer vacationing community, especially with the bungalow colonies. And so I'm going to show a couple of images now. So this is a postcard of the Catskill Mountains. And this is an image in front of one of those cottages or bungalows with women who would go take their children. And this could be even, I talked to women who worked outside the home. They would seasonally leave their jobs to go take their children and spend the summers in these bungalow colonies, and their husbands would go back and forth and go back to work during the week and come to the bungalow colonies during the weekends. And a lot of people I talked to said this was just a really nice break for everybody too, even though the men were still commuting back and forth. They then didn't have to worry about their family responsibilities or anything else during that time as well. But this picture, I love this picture, taken by a person named Harvey Abrams. And he grew up going to these communities. And in this image, you can really see a number of things that are so indicative of this culture and place. One of them is you can see the cigarettes, right, that one woman is smoking. I talked to a lot of people who said that cigarette smoke was often thicker than usual at the Mahjong table because women were relaxing together. They were having fun. And cigarettes are, of course, relaxing if you're addicted to them. And the table coverings, I've heard people call them shmata or, rags to soften the noise of the tiles. You see a lot of those. And in this other image, now you can see this is in someone's home where they have actually then are playing Mahjong. And you can see, obviously, there's a lot of similarities about the game, but that reflects this kind of continuity of some of the rhythms around it.
Someone asked, when did money become involved? When did people start, creating high stakes with money?
Well, one of the things that people often think is true about Mahjong's origins is that a lot of times people think, oh, well, in China, it's always been this high stakes gambling game. That's actually not true. Mahjong has always had this remarkable and unusual social place that brings it across a spectrum of gambling. So you can play for very, very high stakes, or you can play for pennies. And in the traditional Chinese game, you can actually play for nothing at all. Although most people in both American and Chinese Mahjong prefer to play with at least a little bit of something, just to have some skin in the game. But in the American context, even in the 1920s, for white Americans who were coming to the game outside of gambling contexts, there was never really a gambling culture that emerged around it, but there was always low stakes money. So from its origins and introduction to the United States, there was always low stakes. Certainly in some communities, Mahjong can still be a high stakes gambling game, but not the league's game. And when you look at the card, there's different point values associated with different hands based on difficulty. And those used to correspond also with these little like plastic coins that were used as place markers for money. And then people would like, you know, count their chips at the end of a night and cash out just in their own little group's pot of money. But now people just play more directly with coins. But one of the things that happens with the money in the 1950s and 60s in these women's games is that people played oftentimes with a kitty, where they would pool their money, and over time then a group would save enough money to go out to a meal together. Or I talked to one group who actually, they took their husbands to the Catskills for a weekend after they saved enough. And a lot of times people still play with pie, which is a lost cap. So, you know, in the 1970s and 60s, it was common to have a $2 pie. So you knew you were never going to lose more than that. And you could still keep playing even if you had run out of money for that night.
So I feel like I have to bring up that line in Philip Roth's Portnoy's Complaint. It always just sticks with me when he describes Jewish mothers as cows who have been given the twin gifts of speech and mahjong. How did like mahjong become then weaponized as something against Jewish women?
Yeah, those lines from Portnoy's Complaint especially are just, they're vitriolic. I mean, it's a vicious kind of description of many different female characters, but particularly with his mother through mahjong. And Sophie Portnoy is the character's name. And it's linked directly to what I was just describing about how unusual it was and how important it was for women of mothers, right? These are really talking about mothers, carving out time and space for themselves and their friends within the home. And that is also potentially threatening, right? And so what you see in Portnoy's Complaint is that Sophie Portnoy is this terrible character. She's a terrible mother, a terrible person, and mahjong is a way for her to take up more space in the home and with her relationship with her son and her husband. And she uses it as a way to, you know, manipulate her son and get him to help her in various ways. And the people I interviewed, even people who had really difficult relationships with their mothers and very painful relationships with their mothers, for the people I talked to, mahjong, even if it was, again, even if they did not have positive associations with their mother, mahjong often at least was like, oh, good, they're happy, they're doing something else. And many more people had very positive memories of like helping set up the tiles, helping make the special food. Even if they couldn't eat the food right away, it was an exciting night for children in the home very often. And they would create the little pineapples with the maraschino cherries on top, put out the bridge mix. And then a lot of times then they would get to eat the treats later, right? After the ladies were gone or the next day. And so I want to differentiate between this caricature and the I think most people's experiences. But in terms of the social impact of this stereotype that gets attached to this real sharp-edged caricature of a Jewish mother that emerges in the late 1960s, Mahjong becomes interwoven with the ways in which that stereotype serves to attack a lot about upwardly mobile suburban culture. And the Jewish mother figure is kind of left holding the bag for that. And so there's a whole generational rejection of Mahjong that's not only misogynistic, it's also the daughters of the next generation are like, I don't want this. Not everybody said that, right? But lots of people said, I don't want this model of motherhood and femininity and suburban life. I'm doing something else. And many of those people now are in a different life stage and are actually coming back to the game.
So when did it kind of start declining? When did you see the popularity kind of fall off?
It was really I mean, I want to be clear, it never died out. People kept playing. But you had this heyday that was linked to a generational shifts. And so with this heyday also of the Catskills culture and the summer landscapes, that also really starts declining in the 70s in notable ways. And now, of course, there's this kind of ghost landscape in the Catskills where you have a lot of abandoned buildings and this memories of what this landscape used to be, but is not at all anymore right now. And so there's whole changes of patterns around leisure and work that are also true, especially for women. And so not only do you have a generational shift in terms of what is bringing people to the game as wanting to connect within the constraints of 1950s culture, some of that culture was also provided opportunities for time together, and work has taken up more and more and more of our lives. When you have both parents working outside the home, there are certainly good things that come with that, but there is also a reduction in time. You're fitting in all that domestic work then around the edges. And parenting norms changed, right? This was a time when it was much more of a little bit of a hands-off compared to today, where parents tend to be much more involved with their children after school and in the evenings. And so there's many things that have changed that made this particular group, mothers of young children, less likely to be continuing that pattern on, and the pattern did not spread or change. And so it declined until the last several years. And now we're really living in a Mahjong renaissance.
Yes. So yeah, that's what I wanted to get to. What happened? It feels like, anecdotally, it feels like there's a resurgence. And at least among, someone said, why are millennials playing it? But it feels like definitely among maybe like millennials, Generation X, like more and more people are playing it. How did it become sort of a fad again?
Yeah, it is increasing and it is diversifying. I actually think that a lot of what is driving the growth, although it is notable that younger people are playing it, I think just in terms of pure numbers, it's a lot of the retiring generation. And that is also, again, you see this correspond with different life stages. And when people move to new neighborhoods, when they create new communities, Mahjong is a really powerful way to make those connections. And so people are in retiring, often moving to new communities, and also then teaching people a game that they may have played in a primarily Jewish neighborhood or learned from their mothers. And now they're in a very mixed residential community, and they're playing with men, and they're playing with people who don't have a heritage connection with the game. And so you're seeing a lot of crossed boundaries that used to shape different cultures of the game. And I think that there are also a lot of young people coming to it. And I think for people who are coming to it for the first time, it's often connected with a heritage connection. So I know that this is a part of Jewish culture. This is an important identity to me. Especially, this is a kind of cultural piece, right? This is apart from religious differences. It's not theological in any way. And so it's a cultural piece that one artist called, this is one culture that, quote, ties us all together. And he was really talking about across this amazing diversity of American Jewishness. And this is true for Asian American young people as well. I'm aware that I have a cultural connection to this. I don't know it. I want to learn it, or I grew up around it, but I don't actually know how to play it. I want to invest in that. And so that's a strong piece. Beyond that, I think there are a lot of other reasons that, for the purposes of time, I won't go into, but there's more to say.
One of the things your book stresses is that Mahjong has always been a way to find community. In Japanese internment camps, among Chinese immigrants, Jews in the Catskills. Why do you think that is? And are there any lessons that we can learn today from that?
Yeah, it is remarkable how consistent that is of Mahjong as a way to form community. And as you just highlighted, one of the things I talk about is, as Japanese Americans were incarcerated in different camps, they were repeatedly moved, right? I think people who didn't experience this don't realize that. It was a process of continued upheaval. And then after the war, again, having to, or rather after release, again, having to figure out new communities. And Mahjong becomes a way at each of those steps to connect with new people. Another American version of the game is the Wright-Patterson, or Wright-Pat version, named after the Air Force base, Air Force officers' wives. This is a game played on Air Force bases around the world by officer spouses today. And again, it's in these uprooted communities. And so the rhythm of the game itself, because you have these rounds that are often about 15 minutes of play, most of the time, most players aren't necessarily chatting during the game. Occasionally, I will meet people who do. It's unusual. Most people are playing the game for those about 15 minutes. And then in between each round, you have just the right amount of time to talk with people a little bit, because you have to shuffle all these tiles on the table. That takes longer than shuffling a deck of cards. And then you have to build the wall. And in that time, people are able to connect at whatever level that relationship is at. And so for a new relationship, it's just the right amount of time for small talk. But you're getting to know someone, and then you are actually getting to revisit that conversation 15 minutes later. And if you have been playing with the same people, these are people you know and love and have played together for 40 years or more, those 15 minutes are, you're getting to connect on a deeper level, but you're still getting that rhythmic kind of connection. And then, of course, there are things that build around regular groups that meet all the time as well. So but just inherent in the game itself, it has a powerful rhythm to it.
So I see there's a ton of questions, but I have one last question for you. It's, how did you become interested in this topic? Do you have your own Mahjong journey?
I do. But I didn't grow up with the game. I came to it when I was living in China for a year before I began my PhD program at Stanford. And in China, Mahjong is really it's part of the fabric of public life, as well as often in private homes. But it was everywhere. It was played by men and women together, old and young. And I was interested in it, but didn't think too hard about it. There were lots of things that were interesting and new to me. And my aunt, who was not Jewish, but grew up in a strongly Jewish neighborhood of Denver in the 1950s and 60s, had a lot of friends whose mothers played Mahjong at the time. And then in her middle life, when she visited us in China, she had a lot of Jewish friends who played then in their midlife. And she just asked the question, why do my Jewish friends play this clearly Chinese game? And I thought, that answer would be on Wikipedia somewhere, and it's not. It wasn't anyway at the time. No one had done the scholarly research to find out, even though that a lot of people had asked that question. a lot of theories existed, but there was no evidence. And so that got me started. I uncovered the 1920s fad, quickly realized there was a huge and robust source base, and also a really complicated and rich story to tell.
I'm glad you did, because
Thank you.
it was a fun read.
Yay! Thank you so much.
So to get to the questions, a bunch of people asked, what does Mahjong mean?
Yes, great question. It's, you'll hear a lot the word that the name Mahjong means sparrow. It actually doesn't in its current form. In its original form, written form, it was Ma Chui, which does mean sparrow. But in Shanghainese, which was, again, that was the region where it emerged, it would have been pronounced Mojiang. And that sounds a lot like Mahjong, which is the current Chinese name. So the way that we know the game as written now in Chinese does not stabilize until the early 20th century. Still on sets, it created in the 1920s, you will see Ma Chui written on many of those sets, but it was marketed then by, initially by Babcock, mimicked by many, many others, as emerging then from that evolving pronunciation, especially from the Shanghainese influence, and Mahjong. And he added, but he wrote it, like he trademarked that name. He sued a lot of people trying to protect it. And he created that kind of Mahjong, and the double G was really just for effect. It was really just to make it look extra foreign, extra exotic, and that's part of what they were counting on.
That's funny. We touched on this, but a few people were wondering how a game that was often played by men in China and was also introduced by a male oil executive became pretty much an exclusively female game. Great
question. That happens in the 1920s. That happens before it becomes a Jewish woman's game. And that the quick answer to that is really that that's a story of how gender and race are always intertwined. And so in American culture, East Asian cultures, in this case specifically Chinese, have long been associated with femininity, and also just as different from this kind of traditional Western model of masculinity and femininity. And that's wrapped up, that's very, very deeply entrenched. It's part of anti-immigration and anti-Chinese exclusion, specifically in the late 19th century. It's this idea that Chinese men are fundamentally different than white American men. They don't need as much to eat even, right? They eat things that are different. They don't raise the same families. Therefore, they're not appropriate workers. We need to exclude them and protect the American worker who is seen as this white American man. At the same time, a lot of ideas about Asian women then are emphasized, again, either this kind of passive lotus blossom stereotype or a Chinatown prostitute stereotype. Either way, there's this very sexualized portrayal of Asian women. And there's been some really great work and reporting done on that in places like the New York Times, in the context of this recent horrific shootings in Atlanta that targeted especially Korean women. That's because of this history of how race and gender and sexuality have been intertwined. So when you have a game that's so thoroughly emphasized as a Chinese game, and there's this whole performative aspect to the culture that emerges really quickly, in the American context that's dominated by a racial framework that is evolved here, that becomes feminized culturally quite quickly. So that by the end of the fad years, even though, like people are pointing out, men are playing this in China. In fact, it's mostly at that point still a male game, not entirely, but mostly. And these businessmen are marketing it, and bridge experts who are predominantly white men, they're writing about it. There's nothing in the introduction that would tell us this is going to become feminized, but it does. And that's because of the way that these are tied together.
Are there periods where Chinese women and Ashkenazi Jewish women played Mahjong together?
Now. This is really, certainly that happened on an individual basis. I've heard from someone whose family was playing American Mahjong in New York, or the League's game in New York, and it's a Jewish family moved to California, and their parents were playing then with, learned a Chinese version of the game. That was an individual, so it happened on an individual level. It was quite unusual. That was really not what was happening in any significant numbers. Right now, people who are learning that there are different versions of the game, who love the game, who are interested in also meeting people or expanding their own intellectual interest, right? A new challenge, a new game to learn. They're intentionally seeking out other styles. That's happening more and more.
Does online Mahjong exist? And do you think, and it's something that like will continue even post-pandemic?
Yes, I'm sure there are lots of people on the call too who have played online during, especially the pandemic. So there were online versions of the game before the pandemic that has dramatically increased over the last year. And before the pandemic, I interviewed someone who told me that she had, she really loved a competitive, fast-paced game, and she loved her group that she played with, who were certainly fast-paced, but they weren't hardcore, right? It was also a very social engagement. And so she would play online once a week to get that game intensity, not at all social for her. And then she would still meet with her group to get that mix. And I suspect that more people, having tried both, will figure out what they like about each version and may continue to mix it up. But I'm not hearing anyone who has a connection to a particular group that they love meeting with. I'm not hearing anybody say, oh no, I'm not going to do that again. Everybody's excited to be together with the people they know and love.
Yes, for sure. Are there any, well, actually, I'm curious about, you touched on the person you interviewed. What was the interviewing process like? And did you kind of learn anything that you were really surprised about when you were interviewing all these people about the game?
Sure. So I was fortunate to be able to interview dozens of people, over 60 people. And some of them I was able to speak with on the phone. For as many people as possible, I would meet with them in person, usually in their homes. And it was an extremely generous, I just am so appreciative to everyone who spoke with me, who shared their time and their memories, and really shared very personal stories. And so it was a powerful experience. And I can actually share with you the screen just to give a sense. This is Rita Greenstein in Manhattan. She grew up in the Bronx, moved to Long Island to raise her children. Her story is just directly parallel some of that 1950s story I was talking about before. In her later life, she's moved to Manhattan and plays the piano and loves Mahjong. And you know, you can see here, we had coffee together. She shared with me her set. So often that was the kind of rhythm. Someone, you know, we would have a beverage someone generously made, and then I would actually, you know, the set connects so much with people's memories. It connects with relationships they perhaps had with people who have passed away. I'm going to stop sharing now. And it also meant that I could, you know, as part of the research process, there is no archive for Mahjong. This was really a needle in the haystack approach, and it brought me to you know, a dusty room with the unofficial archives of the Parker Brothers company that had bought Joseph Babcock's company in the 1920s. And there was this incredible scrapbook, but right next door to this room, they were still making games. They were still making board games. It was a Hasbro company at the time. It's no longer. Then similarly, while I was doing oral histories, I was able to meet with Dorothy Meyerson's daughter and Marjorie Meyerson Traum, who shared with me her mother's scrapbooks. And these were just incredible treasure troves that I had no idea existed before banging, down a lot of barriers, knocking on a lot of doors, and just really, it was a dozen years of research. And so it was a labor of love.
I don't know if you're still collecting testimonies, but if you just read the comments, you can see everyone has a really amazing Mahjong story to share.
Oh, I'm so glad. Yes, I would love to capture these somehow. I really love hearing people's memories. Yes, I really do.
Do you play the game routinely? And if so, what version?
I do play the game. I do not play it routinely. Mm-hmm. I am part of that historical shift where in my life stage, I haven't made a regular time for that. And I also don't have a community directly around me who's invested in it, in the game. But I really do foresee that I look forward to a time in my life when I can have some of that time to devote to a game. But I also, my career is really mentally stimulating. It's really challenging. I'm fortunate in that way, but that won't always be the case. And so I think one of the things about Mahjong is it's really mentally stimulating. And so I do expect that it will occupy more of my time in the future. But I have played both the very basic Chinese version. The strategy of the Chinese version is really about the scoring, and it's very complicated rules and when you want to get into the details of the scoring. So I have not mastered that by any stretch of the imagination, but I have played the basic traditional Chinese game. And I have played the American version more recently and more frequently. And I really love how each version makes your brain work differently.
Someone was curious, and maybe you could just briefly talk about, in January, there was this company, the Mahjong line, that tried to make a new Mahjong to give it a refresh or makeover, and faced a lot of backlash. Could you give a bit of background about that and maybe why that happened?
Sure, and I'll try to keep it brief. I know there's more to say about any number of these, but so. Yes, in January, for those who aren't familiar with it, there was a company in Dallas, Texas that launched multiple new lines, some of which fully removed any Chinese symbolism or traditional imagery from the tiles and replaced it with images that were actually rooted in partially just their own imaginations and partially also lingo and imagery associated with the American version of the game. They launched it with a significant Instagram and social media campaign, and had language on their website that is much of what sparked, that brought it to attention and then sparked the backlash. So I think it's really important to separate the marketing and their initial marketing, which has changed, but their initial marketing and the changes to the tiles themselves. And what I saw over and over again is that people would often, especially young Asian Americans over social media, reacted with enormous distress and anger and just a furor. It was, I call it a Twitter storm, and a lot of anger, and people who didn't understand where that was coming from, who were familiar with the American game, were reacted oftentimes with complete confusion and defensiveness, like, you're totally wrong. This is just, cancel culture running amok, and not enough talking to each other. And so I think in both cases, there were there was a history that people didn't know when they came to the story. But I will also say that those histories are not equivalent, because where the Asian American response was coming from was rooted in a history that the marketing of the game directly echoed, which is a history of racism and cultural appropriation and erasure that in fact is tied to the game's history in the United States. So when you use language like all the tiles looked the same, that's actually a taunt, a racial taunt that Asian Americans are still confronted with today. And it's part of what is linked in a, I'm not saying the company is linked in this way, but those ideas are linked to a rise in anti-Asian violence right now. And so to have this kind of blithe tone of, we're going to take this Chinese thing and improve it, and I'm going to do so in language that replicates a lot of racist ideas, was deeply upsetting and threatening to a lot of people. And that is very important to understand. So that history is not mostly about Mahjong. That history is mostly about race in America. And Mahjong is a part of that. And part of that shock and horror that greeted them was fueled by people who did not know that there was anything called American Mahjong, that, you know, like our previous conversation, like did not know that other forms had existed, did not know that the tiles had in fact changed over time, did not know that people play with different kinds of sets. And so these tiles that in their homes felt so sacrosanct, so traditional, so rooted to these norms, then to see a company say, oh, here's Maj, right? Here's all these nicknames. They had no context to understand, like, oh, this is actually language that is part of a different tradition of the game that has also taken shape over the past 100 years in the United States. And so I think it's important to kind of differentiate those two aspects. But I do think that there is a larger question for the game's future of, if we have sets, and they're not alone in really radically changing the tiles. If we have sets that become unrecognizable to players of Mahjong around the world, and the rules themselves have changed so much that you can't, you know, it's not actually the same exact game. You can't just sit down and play together. Then is this still Mahjong? Or has it actually evolved into a totally different form? And if that feels very personal to you, if that feels very rooted in a lived experience for you or your family, you're going to have a different reaction to that question than if you don't. And so I think that is a kind of other thread that comes out of this, that is a question about the future of Mahjong, and especially American Mahjong. Where will it continue to evolve to? What shape will that take? And will this continue to kind of be a part of a global conversation or not?
This is a great place to end. Thank you. That was fascinating. Thank you guys for all your questions and stories. We have them saved, so I can't wait to take a look and also send them to Annelise. I encourage everyone to buy her book. It's a really good, it's a good read, a good, you know, beach read, or Catskills read if you're going. And yeah, and please come to Moment Zoominar next week, and go to our website for more commentary on Jewish culture, politics, and religion. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.